To everyone, welcome to the Natural History Museum. As of a few weeks ago, we are officially an accredited dues-paying member of the American Alliance of Museums. Yay! So we do everything that natural history museums do. We do exhibitions and expeditions and educational workshops and public programming, but we make a point to include and highlight the social and political forces that shape nature, yet are excluded from natural history museums. So with this inaugural exhibition, we're kind of cutting the ribbon on our museum's programs and using this programming series of panel discussions, workshops, etc., as an opportunity to introduce folks to the historical and theoretical framework that informs our program. What you see on the wall here are photographs taken at 5 natural history museums across the eastern seaboard. You can see that we are interested in displays of nature and interested in the question of how those displays are constructed, what choices go into them, whether there's a politics to those choices. Is there anything that's omitted or excluded from the picture? For instance, usually when you look at dioramas in natural history museums, you see pristine wilderness, natural landscape. You don't see evidence of man. Yet many suggest now that we are in the age of the Anthropocene, in which man plays, and women, play a very influential role on our landscape. And some more influential than others, you might suggest. So the story of climate change as represented in museums of science and natural history depict it as a problem of counting carbon, of greenhouse gas emissions. But they don't talk about the problem of inequality, the inequalities that are embedded in a system that continues to deny and produce climate change. With this exhibition, we're interrogating the influences that affect the atmospheric climate on Earth, as well as the political funding climate in museums of science and natural history. One of the impetuses or kind of inspirations for this project, I like to call him our muse, is David Koch of the Koch brothers, who happens to sit on the board of New York's American Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in DC. He's also a major donor and exhibit sponsor there. The exhibit he sponsors in the Smithsonian is called the Hall of Human Origins, which is a kind of homage to human evolution. Yet there's a very subtle politics to it that has come under fire by climate scientists and activists alike, where when you first walk in, it's this kind of tunnel that at the end is a digital timeline of how the climate has changed in the history of the planet. And it seems that the suggested takeaway is that climate change has always happened and that it's been an opportunity for us to evolve biologically and technologically, which isn't all that different from the takeaway from the 2009 climate change exhibition that New York's American Museum of Natural History presented. It was a very good exhibition from a science perspective and an education perspective, yet it doesn't go the distance that we might hope that our major revered and influential cultural institutions would go. Yeah, those that are have a mission to celebrate nature and educate children and the public about environmental issues. What would it look like for them to champion a version of nature, a perspective on nature that's capable of sustaining life for generations to come? You know, perhaps They should be presenting climate change not just as a scientific issue, but a social and political issue and an economic issue as well. And that's what our panelists today are going to speak about, coming on the heels of our previous panel with Christian Parenti and Razmik Kuchian called Anthropocene, Capitalocene, or Ecology for All. With this panel, we're looking at counterpower for climate justice. Gopal Dayanani, unfortunately, has the flu and is unable to join us, but we're going to screen a short video featuring Gopal as a narrator in his stead. Eddie Bautista is here with us, and Elizabeth Yeampierre. With this panel, we're looking at what it takes to build a global climate movement. We have to address the asymmetries in the burden of responsibility and the burden of impact. And that requires that we acknowledge the ways that inequalities are deeply embedded in the systems that continue to produce and deny climate change, hindering our abilities to mobilize against it. So now that the world's largest mobilization in March has happened on climate change just a couple of weeks ago, the People's Climate March here in New York and manifestations in cities across the world, what's next? What's next for climate justice activists and for all of us who are interested in fighting for a version of nature that doesn't understand it as something to be privatized, chopped up and sold off to the highest bidder, but rather something that is common to all of us and incumbent upon all of us to safeguard for one another and for generations to come. So I'm going to start with a video. And I might need you to help me find it, Paul. And as he's pulling it up real fast, I'm going to invite you guys. Today is the closing of this exhibition. It's our final day. But we have lots more planned over the next year and the coming years. So I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet if you'd like to hear about upcoming programs, or if you'd like to get involved. We'd love to co-create this experiment with you. And lastly, we do not take donations from the Koch brothers. We did look into taking donations from the Koch sisters, who are a couple of union members who are not related, but recently have started a kind of speaking tour and project as the Koch sisters, who represent very different ideals. And they were going to show up with a giant $5 check as our first donors. Unfortunately, our schedules did not align, but we do rely on the support of folks like you. So there is a donation thingamajig on the wall at the back. If you would like to drop anything in there, it will help us buy drinks for our esteemed panelists afterwards.
There's a lot of talk about the economy these days. Some people say the economy's taking off. Some people say it's tanking. If you really want to make sense of the economy, it's useful to take a big step back and ask yourself, what does economy really mean? But the heart is this tiny little word, eco, and eco means home. Ecosystem is all of the complex relationships of home. It's all the living things, it's all the people. An ecosystem isn't just the catalog of all those things, it's really the relationships. Ecology is the knowledge or study of home. It is the prolonged and thoughtful observation of the living world around you and the consequences of your actions in it. And then you get economy. Economy is simply the management of home. So there are three basic pillars that are true for all economies. You need resources. You need land, air, water. You need the living world around you. The second pillar is you need work. You need labor to combine with those resources to produce stuff. And then you need a culture, a cosmology, a worldview that tells us what we can do with our labor, towards what ends, with the world around us. Then what are the pillars of the dominant economy, the economy that's all around us right now? Well, we get our resources through extraction. We forcefully remove them from the earth. We call this the extractive economy because it's extracting labor as well. We don't view labor as its own valuable natural resource to be applied towards the well-being of ourselves and our communities. And the culture, the worldview, is one in which we can have endless and infinite growth that either ignores or denies the real ecological and social consequences. And the rules that govern this economy, with the use of speculation and financial instruments, are towards one very particular end: the accumulation of greater and greater monetary wealth and power.
The big corporations are being governed really for the benefit of their CEOs. It's not even for the shareholders anymore. Certainly not for the workers, certainly not for the communities.
In the same way that the basis of modern production is extraction from the planet, modern finance is extraction from the larger community towards the financial community, towards 1%.
The system rewards certain people's effort far more than others.
This is not only an economic issue about who's getting the money, it's also a racial issue, it's also a class issue.
Capitalism has exploited people and often leaves out people of color, immigrants, minority communities, women.
At some point, people are like, no, you cannot do that to me and to my community in my home. And therefore, the only way to keep it going is to use force. It's a banks and tanks economy. So the question is, if the extractive economy is what got us into the mess we're in right now, can it get us out? Not likely.
What is required is fundamentally to transform the way things are structured.
The depth to which corporations are integrated into economies around the world mean that we absolutely have to think at the global level, at the international level.
We want to make sure that our productive systems are sustainable. We can't hope that a concentrated power on top just starts acting better. The way that we've been shown that can actually make sustainability in the long term is by breaking that power and by sharing that power democratically.
We need to explore new ways of managing home based on that thoughtful and prolonged observation of the living world around us, ecology.
The new economy has to step away and then push back at those old pillars, because it has to be a new economy that is about sustainable resources, that puts people before profit, that puts planet before profit.
The first pillar is to rethink our relationship to resources.
There's simply no way that we can have this endless, limitless, infinite growth on what is, I think, obviously a finite planet.
The second pillar has to replace the exploitation of human labor with a recognition that all wealth comes through work. And when we take our labor and apply it towards economic well-being, we can create a new cycle that's not based on extraction, but that's based on regeneration. That requires a new third pillar, a new way of imagining our relationship to each other and to home. It's not only possible, it's happening all around us.
One of the most inspiring things is that there are people and groups all over the country and the world who are organizing both to meet people's needs and to actually confront the systems that are underneath the crises.
Underlying all of it is the small d democracy.
I think it could actually change the way things are going to have people actually participating in the decisions that are governing their lives.
Any economic transition has to have this notion of restructuring the way we think about ownership.
Resources are owned by people, by communities. They are not owned by a corporation. The privatization of resources will have to end.
That demands some political muscle, some organizing muscle, and some idea muscle.
How do we develop new business models that create more local ownership and more democratic ownership?
Not just bringing food into communities, but who owns the stores, who's processing the food, who's selling the food to the hospitals and the schools in the communities.
We believe that the more people that have access to opportunities to be able to thrive, the better our society will be as a whole.
The most basic thing we're talking about is human consciousness, and not in the sense of self-awareness, in the sense of how we behave, how we think, how we understand the world we're in, and how we form relationships. And the extent that we start transforming those understandings and those relationships, that's part of forming the new economy today, here and now.
By looking at how we live, we can find how we can live better, more interconnected lives, and simultaneously invest in and build the economy we know we need, and maybe even be happier for it.
Okay, I want to introduce our first speaker, Elizabeth Yeampierre, who's a Puerto Rican civil rights attorney of African and indigenous ancestry, born and raised in New York City, and she is the executive director of UPROSE, which is Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization. Her vision for an intergenerational, multicultural, and community-led organization is the driving force behind UPROSE, and she's a longtime advocate and trailblazer for community organizing around sustainable, just development in Sunset Park. She holds a law degree from Northeastern University and a certificate in nonprofit management from Columbia University. This goes on because she's very illustrious. Elizabeth also has been a powerhouse behind the People's Climate March organizing effort and has done amazing things in Sunset Park. She got New York State's first brownfield legislation, Article X power plant legislation, New York City solid waste management plan passed. She's faced an aggressive urban forestry initiative and helped double the amount of open space and developed a project that resulted in the retrofitting and repowering of diesel trucks for local business. And I'm gonna skip over to, because it honestly, like, it's like that, but like keeps going because it's like that. So I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth for all of your hard work and for making time to be here today. She is the first Latina chair of the US EPA National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, where she initiated the inclusion of youth forum dedicated to developing youth leadership dedicated to environmental justice. So one of the pioneers really forcing that conversation that we're foregrounding environmental justice and climate justice when we talk about the climate crisis. Welcome, Elizabeth.
I kept thinking I was going to go last. So buenas tardes, compañeras y compañeros. Yeah, put it up. Thank you. Just putting up a slide that tells the UPROSE story. It's just, I only have one slide. Sorry, but it's a good one. There we go. There it is. Can you make it big? There you go. All right. I've had the opportunity, first I want to thank Becca and Gan and all the folks that are responsible for doing this innovative project, the idea that you can come into these spaces that have really been defined by Western culture, have been exclusive, have told a very limited narrative, and bring in the stories from the grounds, the real stories, is really powerful and transformative, and I think that turns these institutions back to our communities. And so I would urge you to support that vision, because it's really exciting to see that happen in these spaces. We come to these spaces sometimes as children, and these spaces contribute to a perpetual state of colonization, a perpetual state of internalized racism, and that continues to manifest itself in how you see the power structure in this nation, in our cities, and locally. Gopal and I have been on panels before, and he's always talked about the relationship of people in the earth, and I've talked about the relationship with people with each other. At UPROS, the legislative pieces, by the way, UPROS wasn't solely responsible for that. We're part of coalitions. We work with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and we work with a bunch of other folks that make these things happen. We came to this work because we were born and raised in these communities. We have the health disparities of the people who live in these communities, and we were the children of the civil rights movement. We were the ones who had the opportunity to leave, go to school, and come back and bring those resources back into the community with us. And we really believed that we could be engaged in transformation from the ground up. That we could take, for example, my legal education, take those skills, break them down, and make them accessible so that people can take them into their hands and advocate for themselves. I'm a firm believer in that. I believe in intergenerational relationships because I think that learning happens across generations. And I think that this is in this Anglo-American culture where one generation is pitted against each other, which is driven by that sort of corporate mentality of taking each other out and competing with each other, not just happens across generations, it happens with nonprofits, it happens in every aspect, even on the left, where that competition is what drives who we are, and we really need to be committed to something else. So let me ask how many of you went to the climate march? Okay, so I'm speaking to the choir. All right, I'm speaking to the choir. So you would go to the march and you would think that all is well, right? You would think that we succeeded, so what problems could there possibly be? What could we do better, right? I was at the front, you know, we advocated, worked really hard to make sure that that front line looked like the people of the global South, people from urban communities, from the South Bronx, from South Brooklyn, from our communities that have historically been the ones exposed to all of the environmental harms, all of the toxic stuff. People think that this just happens right now, that we are being exposed to this right now. But because we are the descendants of slavery and colonization, this is a legacy issue. This is harm that has been going on generation after generation. So it's our communities that have had access to the worst food, the worst health care, the worst living conditions, have had to deal with stress generation after generation after generation. And if you study epigenetics, you know what that means in terms of our susceptibility to disease today. And so here we are, right now, at this moment, dealing with climate change. The communities and the people who are less likely to contribute to climate change are the ones that are going to be most impacted. That has been our mantra. And we are dealing with the descendants of colonizers, the descendants that were responsible for slavery, and they're in two different groups. They're the ones that are perpetuating this problem, and they're the ones that are trying to make things better. And among the ones that are trying to make things better, the challenge is how to handle their privilege. How do you work in a way that your privilege doesn't get in the way of addressing climate change? And I think the People's Climate March was a test to our ability to do that. And in some cases it worked, and in some cases it didn't. And so for me, it's my hope that as we move forward, that those folks who didn't quite get it right, that they work with that and that they do some additional work on that. My husband always says, you gotta stop beating people up with the privilege thing, right? But I really do think that there's so much at stake. I think that literally there is so much at stake that it's worth investing in. And I'm comfortable with not being liked. I'm comfortable with people being, oh, there she goes again. If somehow it turns on the lights and people are willing to do the work that is necessary so that we could redefine what we look like and how we work with each other as a society. By 2042, we're going to be the majority in this country. People of color are going to be the majority in the country. They're going to be the majority at the same time as climate change will have fully taken its hold. It will have had its way with us several times by 2042. And so I call it from 1492 to 2042. Right? I made that up. You can use it. You can tweet it. It's all good. Because I'm talking about the fact that extraction didn't begin with fossil fuel, that it began with the extraction of our people. And so here we are in a situation right now where our people are they've internalize the stuff and they give up power, or they work in places where they have to constantly fight for power, and that's exhausting. I can tell you honestly, it's exhausting. For me, dealing with racism and sexism every single day is freaking exhausting. So how do we change that? And how do we flip that script so that we can start creating the kind of society that is addressing this monster, this behemoth that is taking hold all over the world? What we do at Uprose is we start from the ground up. We've got a climate justice and resiliency center. We have doubled the amount of open space. We have stopped the siting of power plants. We have put in, we have an aggressive urban forestry camp, and we build leadership. We've sent 3 young people from around the block to Antarctica, and 1 to the south, and 1 to the North Pole. We often say that our young people are not at risk, that they're at potential. Those of you who've heard me talk about this know that this is a mantra with me, because people saw us, they saw us as people who were at risk. They saw us as people that they tracked. They told Eddie, and I'm gonna embarrass him now, even though he scored in 99th percentile on, you know, on the LSAT and on his scores, that he couldn't go to Harvard. And they told, right, they did, they tracked you. I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that. But they did that to all of us, right? And so they do that with our young people. What we see in our community is brilliant. So we have this block by block organizing effort that addresses mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And if you look at the pictures, you see this is community here. And we start with our young people in 3rd grade. We have 3rd and 4th and 5th graders learning about climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, about organizing, about justice, about building intergenerational relationships, because we've got to start really young. And so the reason we do a block-to-block effort is because we know that every block in New York City is different from the other one. That these visions that people have about disaster and resiliency, these cookie-cutter approaches aren't going to work in terms of us addressing root causes and doing it in a way that's meaningful. After Sandy, what we found was what Eddie calls the disaster industrial complex. The disaster industrial complex. The acronym is very cool. And the idea is that people are making money off of our pain. The same people responsible for perpetuating a lot of the problems are making money from it. And so what they're doing now is they're coming in as consultants, they're getting a lot of funding, and they're coming in with ideas about what is in our best interest. They're coming into our communities to tell us what's in our best interest. But what do we know about our people? What we know about our people is that because they come from struggle, because they come from having needed things, that they've always known how to recycle, repurpose, and reuse. We know that poor people, that people of color have always known how to make the most of what they have, that they've always lived within their carbon footprint. And we know that they are the answer and they have the solutions to just transitions. We know how they create cooperatives, even though they don't even realize they're doing it, how you make sofrito and you share it with everybody on the block, right? These are things that don't have a name to them, but these are things that people in our community do. My neighbor grows a plant. It has a bunch of hijos. She comes to me with a bunch of hijos so that I can plant some. We then pass it on to somebody else, and all of a sudden everybody in the neighborhood has the same plant. These are traditions that come from our countries that we have to reclaim. People who are coming from China who know how to live in huge populations and make the most of what they have. People who are coming from India, people who are coming from Latin America. Those are traditions that other people are exploiting and basically turning into merchandise and selling back to us. We have to reclaim who we are so that we can redefine what being an American is. Because by 2042, we're it. And so we have to reclaim those things. When our people come to this country, they give up those traditions because to be an American means to be wasteful. It means to be addicted to consumption culture. And buying things has a way of narcotizing us and making us feel better about the challenges that we deal with on an everyday level. So now we've got to take our folks who are suddenly here because they wanted the American dream, they wanted all of these things that everybody else had, and tell them that they have to make different choices and that they have to reclaim who they are. Those are some of the things that we're thinking about and doing as we build these relationships across class, race, ethnicity, and generations. We say that a community is defined by having everybody at the table, that it's either all good or it's no good, that you have to have people from different backgrounds, because in having that sort of gathering of people together, that's where the answers are. It's the coolest thing at Uprose when you facilitate these community meetings and you've got these people from different backgrounds coming together, and all of a sudden you see that the solutions are just right there. It is humbling. You have to approach this work with a lot of humility. You have to understand that even if you're a professional, even if you have great ideas, you've been studying this stuff for a minute, even if you think you know, that you have to listen actively and you have to play a different kind of role in terms of facilitating the emergence of community voices that will redefine how we move forward together in these communities. It is the hardest thing to do. Privilege is hard to give up. And so you find in our communities that people sort of discover us and discover what we're doing, and they want to do it and they want to support, but they don't know how. There are lots of ways of doing it without supplanting local leadership. There's a lot of ways of doing it and being respectful. So we now have to redefine what this economy looks like, and we have to redefine what our relationships look like. And we have to have those really hard conversations that are unpleasant for a Saturday rainy afternoon, right? But I think that one of the things that I have found is that when I take the risk and I put it out there, that people really go home and think about it. They work with it and they come back and you see transformation. Everybody who's in this room right now is here because you believe in transformation. Everybody's here because you understand that this stuff, this shit is urgent. Sorry, you're taping that. Oh. I tell the young people that profanity is the language of the powerless, and every once in a while I have a powerless moment. So, So you're here because you believe that that can happen. During this thing, you know, I'm part of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Uprose is also part of the Climate Justice Alliance. And one of the things that happened was art. Art was new to us. All of a sudden, the art took our narrative from the ground and put it up in living color for the world to see. It transformed that march. It told everyone in the world, we are here. I was on panels. You know, I was on Al Jazeera, and I was on you know, what was that channel? The Weather Channel, talking to the people from Iowa. Oh God! So I was on those things, and I had to be able to let folks know who were saying, this is happening in the Marshall Islands, this is happening in Sri Lanka, this is happening all over the world, and the United States is responsible for that. And they were having these conversations about the United States as if we don't exist within it, as if there's no global South in the United States, as if there's no Detroit or Richmond or Sunset Park or Red Hook or the South Bronx or Brownsville or East New York, as if we are not here. And these things are happening to our communities. And so we would have been invisible had we not had the art take our story and make it global. And we would have been invisible if we had not had the front line. And the fact that we even had to fight for it it speaks to some of the challenges that we have among people who are in the climate movement. People in the climate movement maybe thinking now that the new frame is climate justice, and it's not going to be unless we figure out that it is okay to let people of color lead. And people don't want to take a back seat. It's like the smartest kid in the room always raising their hand. We found in the march, for example, the folks running to the front and saying, do you have a problem with letting the young people of color be in the front? Is there a problem with this? I'm telling you, man, it got me through the 2 miles. It did. Just a little fight. Every 5 blocks, there was a little fight. And so I was propelled. How does a community organization like ours, which is small, do big things? I mean, we do big things. You know, we stop power plants, we change the whole neighborhood, we've changed infrastructure, we've built leadership. We do that because we have people. We don't have resources, we should, we don't, but we have people. And people really are at the heart of all kinds of transformation. And so I would urge you to really rethink your approach when you come into a community. And it doesn't matter whether you're a person of color or not. If you're a person of color, that you come with resources and you come with an education, you have to approach that space in a way that is respectful, that says, how can I support? How can I be, how can I make sure that you have the resources you need to me? How can I help? Not, I'm here and I'm visiting you because, I'm in Sunset Park and I'm doing this and I'm doing that and I discovered Sunset Park and I'm parachuting in. But, how can I show solidarity? What are the things that you need? How can I use my skills and my resources and whatever technical assistance I have to facilitate the creation of a groundswell of support around climate justice? And that's the conversation that has to be had. We are conditioned, especially those of us, and let me just talk about the people of color for 1 second. If you have a BA, a master's degree, a law degree, or whatever, and you're a person of color, you are someone who had to defy all kinds of things. And you then become that go-to person in every room. And so you start being conditioned to start believing the hype. You need to, even we have to check our own stuff, and we have to put it in check and say, we are going to be the facilitators of community leadership and community power. That's why we went to school. That's why there was a civil rights movement to make those things happen. So I don't know if I've talked a lot about fossil fuel extraction. There's a lot of stuff about it. I just know that you all know about it. You do. And the connection between that and climate justice is clear. I don't think I need to educate you on that. You all know. I think the harder conversation is always really about how do we work with each other? How do we support each other? How do we create meaningful community power on the ground? And I have to tell you, and Eddie's going to come up next, the amazing things that when it works, the amazing things that we're able to do. So, muchas gracias. I'm happy to take questions after he's done. Gracias.
So while that's loading, I'll introduce Eddie. He's the executive director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, which is a network of community-based organizations advocating for the empowerment and just treatment of environmentally overburdened neighborhoods. Before that, Eddie served as the director of the New York City Mayor's Office of City Legislative Affairs, where he spearheaded efforts to pass several landmark laws, including New York City's 20-year solid waste management plan, and the director of community planning for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, where he organized coalitions blocking the siting of polluting infrastructure in overburdened communities, and revising public waste and energy policies. Eddie is an award-winning urban planner and community organizer, and also a visiting professor at Pratt Institute's graduate program for sustainable planning and development, and a key organizer in the People's Climate March. Eddie.
Thank you. I think we'd start with a little video. Any less time that I'm actually talking, people are usually grateful for. So do I just start?
The People's Climate March will take place 2 days before President Obama and world leaders attend a climate summit at the UN.
Climate change will bring more extreme weather, and action is now more urgent than ever.
Millions of people around the world gather in the largest climate action march in history.
The biggest gathering seeking to address climate change ever.
2,000 rallies in 162 countries, from Paris, Melbourne, Australia, Rio de Janeiro.
Activists are filling the streets to demand action on climate change.
We are here because we are redefining this moment, this movement, this time. I want to thank all of the marchers today for coming together and taking a stand. We need you.
Also, a massive people's march. I hope the leaders of the world listened.
We're the first generation to deal with the impacts of climate change and the last who can do anything about it.
Time is running out.
Don't give up the fight. Our citizens keep marching. We cannot pretend we do not hear them. We have to answer the call.
How to do a dismount on this. So this is not news. Most of you were there. Part of what I'm here to talk about is how did we get there? And by we, I mean Elizabeth and I are essentially city kids, right? I mean, it's always funny to have a middle-aged man refer to himself that way, but you know, we were born and raised here in New York City, right? We were born and raised at a time when it's a very different New York, and in many ways, for people who didn't grow up during the period that we grew up in, it's almost like a bad 70s movie. But the thing about those 70s movies is that they were kind of filmed on the streets of New York, and it was real. We grew up at a time when from the late 60s through the late 70s, over 600,000 apartments were burned out of the South Bronx, Central Brooklyn, Red Hook, Sunset Park, all the neighborhoods that you heard Elizabeth talk about. That was just one aspect of the hell on earth that was New York City and most urban areas in the 60s and 70s. Most of our communities were devastated by arson, redlining, blockbusting. Redlining and blockbusting was essentially a way that corporations and banks and insurance companies would refuse and agree which neighborhoods they would allow investments in. Redlining essentially meant banks would draw a red line around an entire neighborhood and deny loans in those communities because they were bad investments. You had urban renewal, which some of you have heard is termed Negro removal. There was a policy in the early 70s in New York called planned shrinkage, which was an actual city policy where a neighborhood had gotten so bad, the disinvestments and the white flight and all the extractive economies writ local, right? Like all the stuff that had been taken out of the neighborhood. Planned shrinkage was a policy where cities said, you know what, we are going to deny the last remaining basic services to that community so that we could force out the last handful, thousands of people that are there, so that we can then, those of you who know anything about development know it's easier and cheaper to redevelop a vacant block than it is to do what they call infill housing, right? So planned shrinkage was a policy where in neighborhoods in the South Bronx or Central Brooklyn, they would close firehouses, they would close down, they would move voting precincts. So you couldn't even vote in the neighborhood. They would close hospitals. So this was an actual policy where we would starve the community of basic human resources just to force them to live. This was the context that we grew up in. So for us, environmental justice, this notion of the disproportionate burdens visited on low-income communities and communities of color, is just the way we lived. That's what we knew. For us, the issue of climate change, you have to kind of back up and look at this notion of environmental justice as a movement. The New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is a citywide coalition, as Becca was saying, and thank you, Becca, and the Natural History Museum for having us here. It's a brave and innovative plan that the museum's launching, and to be able, as Elizabeth said, to confront static images of what is historical and what's cultural is always a brave mission and a needed one. The notion of environmental justice, the Alliance came together in the early 90s when multiple communities were facing guerrilla warfare on different siting of infrastructure. In the South Bronx, they had to fight actually a medical waste incinerator. There was actual, I mean, some of this stuff almost sounds like bad sci-fi, right? But there was an actual proposal to take red bag contaminated medical waste and burn it in an incinerator in the South Bronx. In North Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, there was a fight against a company, I think that's still there, called Radiac, which is a radioactive waste transfer station sited across the street from a public school in mostly, at that point, it's, I think in that neighborhood, part of the neighborhood, still mostly Latino. You had in the South Bronx, North Brooklyn, in Harlem, you had the expansion of a waste sewage treatment plant. And what became clear to us as different neighborhood guerrilla fights popped was that our fights against facilities would be maybe victorious for that one facility, but that there were structural issues leading to the siting of these facilities. There's a reason why blocks in the South Bronx look very similar to North Brooklyn, look very similar to Sunset Park. Issues having to do with zoning, issues having to do with some communities having the wherewithal to be able to rezone and have the legal and political resources to shape their land and their contours based on what their desires were. And what's interesting about things like zoning is as you take land off the table that you could site noxious facilities in, the rest of the land where it could be sited on grows smaller and smaller. So the reason why the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance came together was for those fights, that were systemic, structural fights. It's a bad joke, but it's kind of like the Avengers, right? Those fights that Thor and Iron Man can't fight alone. Nobody ever likes that joke. I should stop. Right? Resiliency is a lot of things, including stubborn, and so is my sense of humor. So the Alliance came together in the early 90s to do that, right? Our connection to climate change specifically goes back to the 90s, predates Sandy, predates Hurricane Irene, predates the 2 or 3 tornadoes that hit Brooklyn, tornadoes hitting Brooklyn, microburst, multiple nor'easters. For us, you got to go back to the 90s. In the late 90s, New York City was updating something called its Coastal Zone Management Plan. In New York City, it's called the Waterfront Revitalization Program. As part of that, there was, and what basically the Coastal Zone Management Plan does, it basically breaks up your waterfront into what sorts of uses are allowable, right? So you have still, in New York, a natural waterfront. Those of you from the Rockaways can appreciate and will vouch for the fact that yes, we still have natural waterfront in New York. You have the something called the redeveloping waterfront, which is a euphemism for luxury housing and gentrification, and you have the industrial waterfront and the recreational waterfront. The industrial waterfront has a subset that emerged in the late 90s called significant maritime and industrial areas, and there are only 6 of them. They're in the South Bronx. They're in Newtown Creek, which is one of 2 Superfund sites in New York City. They're in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and the North Shore of Staten Island. Originally, Gowanus Canal, the Gowanus neighborhood, was supposed to be a significant maritime and industrial area, but the city knew that it was going to try to rezone for luxury housing before they knew it was a Superfund site to be. So that's one of the reasons it wasn't designated as an SMIA. So part of the, and part of our work is, it's complicated, right? Because the easy and lazy reaction from some communities is, look, we've had enough of these industrial uses, they're killing us, you're clustering all this stuff in our neighborhoods. And it's a human response, and you can understand that, right? But from our perspective, we see ourselves as industrial retention advocates. We still need a place in this town where working people can get a job, right? And just to give you an example, so the New York City Economic Development Corporation, not a source I like to often cite, but they had an analysis that showed that the median annual salary for industrial jobs in New York City is something about $60,000 a year. Covers a broad range of activities, but still, in terms of median income, it beats the service sector, it beats the retail sector, and basically it's a sector that people who are not necessarily college bound can get a job, right? So from our perspective, this notion of pitting the environment against the economy, and in many ways, in much more lofty and cerebral terms, you heard Gopal talk about it, you can't pit those two things together. You can't somehow write off entire communities. In fact, those of you who've taken neoclassical economics will recall what pollution in neoclassic economics is called. Does anybody remember what that is? Somebody in the crowd always knows. What? Externalities. That is what pollution, this is what neoclassical theory calls pollution. Externalities, someplace else, right? So from our perspective, this notion of, jobs versus the environment or economy versus, that's a staid and dangerous paradigm. That's not one we can no longer support. So from our perspective, we see ourselves as industrial retention advocates, but that doesn't mean that we're willing to sacrifice our air quality, water quality, our ability to live in these neighborhoods. So we started trying to find ways of introducing environmental protections in these significant maritime and industrial areas. But those of you who remember who was running New York City in the late 90s, the only thing the Giuliani administration was more hostile to than civil rights was environmental protection. And you tried to combine the two like we did, we were dead in the water. It was going nowhere. So we had to bide our time. And then in 2010, the city decides to embark on its new waterfront revitalization program. And with the Bloomberg administration, and you know, so Becca outed me. So yeah, I did work for the Bloomberg administration for the second term, when it was still a 2-term limited, you know, city. So I thought I thought it was cool. And he wasn't a Republican then, so I do all the caveats that nobody ever buys it. But the thing about the Bloomberg administration that I always tell people is, and these are most of my friends, as much as you hated most of his policies on public health and the environment, what I tell them is even a broken clock is right twice a day. Right? Like every once in a while, even a broken clock is right twice. So I tell them that was the 2 times the Bloomberg people got it right. On public health and the environment, for the most part, people generally support that. So by that time I had left city government and we had this new way of going back at this waterfront plan, and we thought, okay, we could try to sell this. What we had in 2010 that we didn't have in the 90s was a climate change toolbox. And what we saw, I guess now in retrospect, shouldn't have been a shock to anybody, but to us, you just kind of like, we found stunning. Is this how we did? Okay. So this is, you may not be able to see it well, but this is a map that we did of the city's waterfront, and we looked at the significant maritime and industrial areas. From top to bottom, A, B, C, D, E, and F, those were the neighborhoods I mentioned: South Bronx, Newtown Creek, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, North Shore of Staten Island. What we didn't know was that how vulnerable each one of these significant maritime industrial areas, or as we call it, home, was to climate change and storm surges. So what you see there, the orange, are storm surge overlays that we did with the New York State Office of Emergency Management. And we quickly came to realize that forget Category 3 or 4, forget Category 1 hurricanes, nor'easters, or even a heavy rainstorm, all of our neighborhoods were vulnerable to storm surge. And so now we had a 20th century paradigm of clustering all the heaviest industrial, toxic chemical, all these different uses. Not only did we have to grapple with our day-to-day exposures to these, now we had the 21st century dilemma of storm surge, grabbing all that stuff and sweeping it through a neighborhood. And just so you can see that I'm not making things up, this is Sandy. This is Red Hook. Those of you know Red Hook, these are the Civil War era warehouses across the street from Fairway. This was, as you can still see, daylight hours. So the worst of Sandy was still hours off, right? What, do you guys, who was here for Sandy? Right? What do you guys remember what time, what was the worst of it? Do you guys remember? About 9, 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock. I remember because I was hiding under my couch crying, right? Like, I mean, so you remember it was nighttime. It wasn't. This is daytime, and usually the bay stops. This is a street light, and usually the bay stops here. And as you can see, it's already sweeping through here. On this first floor is a printer. This printer was interviewed in New York One about a week after Sandy. This guy did not want to go back into his place of business because the water line was about 8 feet. He knew the chemicals that he used in that place. He didn't want his workers or himself exposed to that stuff. So you basically had, and by the way, look, these are businesses that are not, these are not nefarious people. These are people that are doing their legally permitted. This guy runs a print shop. You know, he employs people from the community. This is not a guy who is doing anything other than trying to eke out a living and trying to live within the permits that government has given him. But nobody, including government, expected one day Buttermilk Channel to come rushing through his place of business. And this is what we're faced with. And what we always tell people when we give them this context is that even if you don't care about our communities, think about this. One of the SMIAs is in the South Bronx. And they're in the South Bronx and surrounded by waste transfer stations. For example, the South Bronx handles despite having less than 5% of the city's population, handles over 25% of the city's garbage, right? These transfer stations surround something called the Hunts Point Food Distribution Network, or Center. The Hunts Point Food Distribution Center feeds the region. 23 million people from New York, Long Island, and Connecticut, and Northern Jersey get their produce, get their fish, get their meat from the Hunts Point Food Market. Why does it matter, right? When Sandy hit, high tide for the body of water that surrounds the South Bronx is something like, I mean, people that don't know New York always say, what? It's actually called the Long Island Sound, but that's what surrounds the South Bronx. Long Island Sound was at low tide when Sandy hit. Had Sandy hit a few hours before or after, Long Island Sound would have been at high tide, and you guys want to ask about high tide, ask anybody in the Far Rockaways, Coney Island, or Staten Island what high tide in Sandy was like, right? The South Bronx had a little bit of damage, but it was at low tide. Had it been at high tide, the mayor's office has since confirmed that the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center would have been disrupted for nobody knows how long, which means our food supply for the region would have been disrupted for nobody knows how long. If you guys thought the gas line fights were nasty, try cutting off food for an indeterminate period of time. This is what we're talking about in a real way, in a concrete way. For us, what brought us to that march was these kind of clear and present dangers that our communities had been facing for now a few generations, and now writ large is threatening everybody, not just us. And this whole notion of how our communities are the first hit and the worst to recover, and this notion of resiliency, just to give you just one more example, this is the New York Times storm surge map. And one of the things that we discovered, just some statistics, of the something on the order of over 35,000 public housing apartment units, 35,000 NYC-EJA, New York City Housing Authority units, which is over 20% of all public housing were impacted by Sandy, right? If you look at the renters in New York City, over 64% of renters in New York City that were impacted by Sandy made annual household incomes below $28,000 a year. And you know that under $28,000 a year in New York City is poverty level. So when we talk about the disproportionate burdens and disproportionate vulnerabilities, you don't have to look beyond Sandy just to see how one snapshot of one severe weather event and its disproportionate burdens and impacts on low-income people and people of color. The issue of climate resiliency that we always talk about is that the popular notion of resiliency is the ability to bounce back, right, from a severe weather event. And we are constantly asking ourselves, bounce back to what? Bounce back to an inequitable system, a system that exploits, that extracts, that's slowly killing people. That, for us, resiliency has to be more than that. It's not about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward, right? So from us, from our perspective, the whole notion of the People's Climate March was a way for us to take this story and these exposures that we know that are South Bronx, South Brooklyn, and Global South related, and put it up in terms of not just what the movement is today, but what it has been. There's this notion that, you know, and it's on some level it's a little funny, on some levels it's a little pathetic, but this notion that while people discover that there are grassroots movements fighting this stuff, and they're shocked that there's gambling in the casino, right? The work has been going on for a long time. As Elizabeth mentioned, among the things we've been able to do is we've been able to reorient the city's solid waste management plan so that rather than trucking the city's 36,000 tons per day of waste, and that is a staggering amount of waste. I want that to, it's not gonna sink in today. When you go home, think of 36,000 tons per day. 80% of that waste is handled in North Brooklyn, the South Bronx, and Southeast Queens. What passes for a victory for us was to force the city to switch from an export system that's truck and rail based to truck based to one that's rail and barge based. Each barge of New York City waste will remove 48 tractor trailer trucks, 48 18-wheel trucks. For us, that's a measure of environmental justice in New York City. Tell that to the communities that we're still sending the garbage to. Landfills throughout the South, landfills in Pennsylvania, landfills. So for us, we have spent the better part of almost 2 decades fighting for a waste export system that's not killing us, so we could get to the next fight, and it's a fight that we've been fighting at the same time, to vastly reduce the amount of waste New York City produces. Increase recycling, which if we recycle at a 15% rate, which is beyond pathetic. We have a law that's pathetic, and we can't even hit that law, which is we're supposed to be recycling at 25%. Most of the city's greenhouse gases are generated by less than 2% of its building stock. Something like 15,000 buildings in New York City generate over 45% of the city's carbon, of the greenhouse gases. And if we were to force these cities to retrofit so that they are not polluting at that level, not only will we be saving our, and reducing our carbon footprint, we would be generating literally thousands of jobs in the process. So when you hear people talk about, and Gopal, right, and Elizabeth, when you hear them talk about the fact that climate change and this new framework and this new culture and this new approach, this is economic development. I don't know how many of you guys saw this, but the announcement that Mayor de Blasio made right before the climate march, and that took months of pressure from the People's Climate March to make him make that announcement, right, which was a no-brainer to him. Should have been, but we had to actually fight for that. His plan about getting New York City to 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050, that is a huge victory, but getting there is going to be the real fight. And this is what we've been telling everybody. That march wasn't the end. That was the beginning. And the real work is in front of us, and we look forward to working with you all, and thank you.
Thank you for that. So I want to open this up to a discussion, and we have a couple of mics there so that we can make this more of a participatory discussion, since there are so many organizers in the room who are involved with the Climate March and thinking about next steps. One thing that I really appreciate about the work that both your organizations do is how you understand environmental issues and climate change as something that touches on so many issues that affect us in our day-to-day lives. And in particular, even talking about urban planning, Juan Camilo Osorio presented here, right? And I know that Uprose, with your Climate Youth Justice Workshop, does gentrification and climate change training, which I think is excellent, because we think how big green groups over the last couple of decades have talked about climate change, and inequality has been missing from the discussion. Yet when we frame it just as renewables and clean energy and clean tech as the solutions that we get look like Eco-Atlantic in Lagos, Nigeria, now, which is a near zero carbon emission city with clean technology, yet the average plot costs $5 to $6 million, and the average Lagosian makes $2 a day. And even here in New York City, Bloomberg was a green mayor, right, championing through Plan NYC climate change legislation and planning, but he was also the gentrification mayor. And so I want to ask you, in the wake of the Climate March, just to open up discussion, were there inroads made in changing the discourse on climate to really foreground a justice lens? And were new infrastructures developed that we should be building upon in order to grow the climate justice movement?
So I would say the answer is yes and no. For many years, those of us who've been part of the environmental justice movement, by the way, when Eddie said we've been working on this for 20 years, that's another reason why it has to be intergenerational, because you have to start really young, because by the time you get legislation passed, right? So we've been struggling with the big greens for many years. When they realized that demographics were changing, they started hiring environmental justice organizers to come into our community and do the work that we were doing. I think this march gave us an opportunity to really sort of redefine that relationship. So I see a lot of positive coming out of that in terms of working in a way, the way that's worked best for us. And I think the work the way that would work best in the future is when these organizations with a lot of resources use those to support the local struggle at our request. When we ask them for a white paper, when we ask them for an attorney, or when we ask them for research and something that helps us move our agenda locally. And so I think that, and I'm hopeful that there's going to be more of that moving forward. What I've heard is that already a lot of them who really weren't part of making this march happen are already getting funding and are already taking credit for it and moving fast. And they're gonna, that's a real problem. It's a real problem when funders and the folks don't know who made this thing happen, and the fact that we were able to not only reframe the issue, but we were able to bring our communities out. I did a presentation for the 90 member groups of the Hispanic Federation. I spoke to people who worked with the elders, with the Department of the Aging, with young people, with social services, with really non-traditional groups that are more social servicey that would never think about how you integrate climate change into their work. We were really thinking out of the box about how we reach out to all of these groups to make sure that they would show up. And that they would think moving forward, how do they integrate it into the work that they're doing? And they're doing that. And to see an organization like the Hispanic Federation, which is what you would call a mainstream Latino group, really thinking about climate justice and how it's going to affect its huge membership, which is millions, actually. It's not a small thing, the Hispanic Federation. Is a big thing, and this climate march provided us with the vehicle to do that. The Rockefeller Foundation, I think right after, put out an announcement that they're divesting. So there's a lot of good stuff that immediately, like right after, came. And I think a lot of people who didn't believe when we were saying this was going to be the largest climate march, and now saying, oh hell, I missed the party, and are thinking about rethinking how they're going to be moving forward. So,
yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think the part of the thing with capitalism and all the structures, even the progressive ones that are embedded in capitalism, as Elizabeth said earlier, learn all the wrong lessons, right? So, like the foundation community, the nonprofits, it's the system is set up for conflict and competition, not collaboration, and that's part of the problem that in redefining the thing as we're challenging it, it doesn't get more complicated, especially when the system, in terms of a capitalist system, is designed to morph with profit always at the end of it, right? So there's a reason why you have, economic groups patterning themselves and putting on the green, as you always say, the green patina. There is a reason why Fox News did not dispute that there were 400,000 people in the street. And it's also quite telling that the worst they could say was that we littered that day. So mind you, this was a powerful moment, and there's going to be all kinds of people and institutions are going to try to exploit this, because that's what capitalism does. It trains you on a cellular, it's part of our DNA as a society to try to get over. Right? And try to exploit and extract. So what we have to do, this thing about the march being just the beginning is real. We have to figure out, how do we maintain these relationships that got built? How do we maximize the ability? And one of the beautiful things, and also one of the frustrating things of the People's Climate March, this goes to Becca's question, is like, what's the infrastructure? That, like, a bunch of hubs were developed, right? And what was one of the reasons I think we got to this number was because it wasn't a highly centralized thing. It was through the hubs, a way for people to just take it and run. Part of the problem is every once in a while they'll run like over, groups that have been doing this work for a while. But I think that I'm hoping that aspect of it is really growing pains. I think that there are infrastructures in place, and the hubs are going to continue. The website will continue. There's a lot of conversation and understanding about what's going to happen with all the email addresses and the phone numbers and the data stuff. But I think what's really important is that already I'm seeing movements and campaigns re-energized because of what happened. But if we don't keep the relationships honest and transparent and just, you know, the system will figure out a way to contort what just happened a couple of weeks ago.
I just want to add briefly that a few years ago, people were talking about the green economy. And I remember criticizing it and thinking, all right, so we're going to make green widgets and we'll make millions and millions of green widgets. And literally, it wasn't making sense to me because it meant that we were going to continue with the green patina, being involved in production that was not sustainable, that was not local. And I think that with this march and with the coming together of a variety of people, we're really seriously talking about what local economies look like, what just transitions look like, what does a new economy look like, how do you live with what you need instead of what you want, and really sort of making that the sexy thing, right, instead of having all of these things that people have historically wanted. And I think that that's also one of the things that came out of this that's really positive.
Just one other question before I toss it out is, there were a number of critiques that I read of the climate march, and I felt like there was, you know, some valid critiques there, but one of the misunderstandings underlying those critiques was the suggestion that it was about the march itself, a symbolic event, and missing the point that a march is a punctuation mark at the end of months and months of relationship building and meetings and the development of infrastructure, and that we're only as strong as we are by the things that propel us forward afterwards. And also that the march was very much in relationship with Flood Wall Street the next day, which was the space where we could get more specific about calling out targets and about critiquing capitalism. And so I want to open it up to folks to share your reflections and thoughts about what worked, what challenges you saw, where you think the movement, the opportunities for the movement are going forward. There we go. Kick us off.
Hello, I'm Anthony, Eddie, Elizabeth, you know I love you. My question is literally to ask you for advice, and I tried to get in touch with you, Elizabeth, last week, but you were super busy. I work for a mid-sized, mid-major environmental organization, and I've been up literally all night since yesterday when there was some infighting within my organization. I am really trying to push EJ as a very, very important issue. And we're talking about mainstream environmental organizations. And right now, what seems to be occurring is there's this pyramidal hierarchy where we have certain communities that should be protected that was created, I don't think it was her intention, by Lois Gibbs and NIMBYism, but it had to get into somebody else's backyard, guess whose. And then shortly underneath that is the protection of natural resources and animals, right? Bears and spotted owls. And then there's like EJ, right? And I guess that what I'm trying to ask you literally for advice is, how do we get membership, okay? Because it's not just the organizations, right? Organizations are run, the lifeblood of these organizations, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, et cetera, are their members. And these environmental organizations, they send out test emails to their members, and you send out an email about, yo, Louisiana, New Orleans, which happens to be a chocolate city, is not gonna be there in 50 years, and we need your help to get Bobby Jindal to stopping the lawsuit against oil and gas. And that doesn't test well, but you send out an email about bears are being killed in Maine, and like, you're getting flooded by it. So how do we move from a pyramidal hierarchy to a more concentric one where you have these circles with intersections, right? Because my biggest fear, Naomi Klein's latest book has literally kept me up all night. Climate justice, I'm afraid, is going to go down the path of the same remedies that got us out of the financial crisis, where it only benefited the same people who got us into the financial crisis, right? We're already seeing retrofitting of new buildings being sold in New York where it's sandy proof, but you got to have dinero, which I work for a nonprofit. I don't have that loot. So, I mean, seriously, I'm like begging you for advice. What do I do? Because I feel like, as one of the only persons of color in my organization, that I'm living the scenario that I always read about, where I either have to go to an environmental justice organization to really do what I want to do, or I'm gonna continue to be ostracized and eventually just throw my hands up and say, excuse my language, fuck it, and walk away, because you're not listening, you know, and you don't care. So any advice, literally,
I'm going to give you guys the mic, but I also want to invite folks in the audience to respond and turn this into more of a discussion. There's 2 mics over there. If anybody's interested in contributing, raise your hand.
So Anthony, I can respond to you because I was organizing a march against police misconduct in Sunset Park less than a week after the People's Climate March. And the reason I share that with you is because the people in New Orleans who have dioxin in their bloodstream don't really care about the spotted owl or the polar bear, because their livability is challenged by the fact that they're surrounded by petrochemical industries down in New Orleans. And so the thing is what is relevant, right? And what kind of resources do you have, and what kind of time do you have? And our communities are in the intersection of all of these isms and all of these things, you know, having to do with education and employment and health and things that really affect our ability to even survive. And so being part of a conservation group or a group that cares about things that don't seem connected to us is not a priority. When we talk about global warming, for example, we don't talk about the polar bear, but we talk about what are those things in the Caribbean that are dying? The coquis dying, yeah, the coquis dying. All right, the coquis. We talk about the coquis, but actually it wasn't that, it was the coral reefs. We're talking about the coral reefs because so many different kinds of species of fish depend on them, and it's going to take out an entire economy. And so we try to bring it home to where people live. We bring it to the Caribbean because a lot of Caribbean people in New York City. And that's one of the ways. But I think the problem is the culture of the institution that you work in. And I don't think that you can change that. And they're going to exist until they die, until we basically, you know, reproduce them out, to be honest. But there's hope. You know, you've got REC, for example. For me, REC is a model of an organization that is getting it right. You know, you've got all of these young people from different kinds of backgrounds really understanding what climate justice is, really making the connection between that and divestment, and working with communities of color and leadership of color in a way that's very different than these top-down organizations. And for those of us who are people of color, we don't want to be the passive recipients of somebody else's good intentions. So we are not going to work for these institutions because that's not where our energy, our skills, and our time is best invested. But I don't know how to fix your problem. I can just tell you that the culture of an institution, if it doesn't shift, is just going to languish because the demographics speak for itself.
I'm gonna have a different approach, and and it's not gonna make you any more happy than what you just heard, but I'm gonna keep it real with you, bro. The movement has pushed for decades for these organizations to hire people like us. You understand what I'm saying? So, you know, on the one hand, you being there is testament to part of our struggle to make sure that they hire people like us, right? But it is, what Elizabeth just said, is also unhealthy. So I don't want you to feel like you're, you know, movement bound to suffer there. I will say that for us, institutional change hardly ever happens from the outside. It has to happen from the inside. It's subversive. There's no other way to, but what I've seen happen is part of it is when you get older, you actually have like this view of time. We've seen some of these institutions change. Now, whether they've changed because they see the writing on the wall, they read the demographics, I don't know, but I know that some of them have begun to change. But that burden shouldn't be on you, because listen, I did my 16 years at a public interest law firm, and I ain't going back. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I went over the wall, and they ain't gonna bring me back, you know? I did the mayor's office straight up as a subversive thing. That whole Plan YC thing was gonna be very different if some of us weren't in there. You understand what I'm saying? So all I can tell you is, whatever you can stand. What I will say is one thing. What the institutions, and this is where it made that intersection of your mental health and our community health, if there's a way you can get your institution to figure out a way to partner not dictate, partner with community, with EJ groups and climate justice movements, especially now after this march. I get the feeling that people are going to be listening to you a little differently than maybe before this march. A lot of these big guys sat it out. What Elizabeth said, I'm going to say that NRDC, EDF, they were asked to pony up something. Hook a brother up, $5 grand, nothing. They gave nothing. Now what we're hearing is they're going to foundations asking for funding for this. So you're in a rare position of power there. And if there's anything that we could do to help that, let us know. But if you got to run, then run, bro.
No, I'll be calling you for sure, and I definitely appreciate that, and I agree with like everything that you said, because I mean I'm thick-skinned. I'm from Harlem. My mom was West African. I mean I've got some of the scars to prove how thick-skinned I am, but so I'm not ready to cut and run yet, because it's like like if I do that, I feel like I'm kind of letting the reason why I got into environmental planning down. You know what I mean? For me, it was like, why are all my friends getting asthma all of a sudden, and my people on Riverside Drive are able to run a marathon? What's up with that? And that's like what got me into this movement. So, I mean, I'm gonna stick it out. You might have to put on your therapist hat or something like that. Eddie, but
when you're ready to run, let us know.
You ready to run? Yeah.
When you run, let us know.
Absolutely. But no, I definitely appreciate your answer, and yeah, we'll keep in touch. Thank you.
So, when Elizabeth asked the question at the beginning, how many of you went to the climate march? A lot of you raised your hands. How many of you would call yourselves an organizer involved with organizing the climate march? Okay. All right. So I want to invite those of you who just raised your hands to share your reflections and contribute to the conversation. So right here at the front. And then maybe the second mic could go to the row right behind with Ghana and Raquel.
So, thank you. Hi. I was a peacekeeper for the indigenous cultures contingent, and I'm very appreciative of this moment in particular, because I realized where my privilege, where my color, and the things I've learned in college got in the way of protecting the sacred space that the Native Americans created as they were marching down. And they asked me to be a guard so photographers wouldn't jump in, but I took that guarding to the next level. I was like, let me protect these people. So I want to check myself. I definitely do. I don't know if does that answer your question back? Is that okay?
Yeah, however you want to respond, just share your reflections. And and do you think differently about the climate movement now after the climate march than you did before?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The People's Climate March showed me that we can move as one body, but what happens afterwards really says something about that body. It was almost 600,000 people at the march, but maybe 2,000 that flooded Wall Street. If I may, my question is, how can we be political bodies that say there's something wrong with my system, with this system, I'm willing to put my body in front of it to say something? How can we be political like that? And, but not go to jail. Because I feel like being handcuffed and taken away feeds the system too.
So can I address that? Because that's a big issue for us. We organize Uprose organizes the largest gathering of young people of color on climate change in the entire country. And we do that every year. And we don't put young people of color in harm's way. We don't do anything to put them in the system. And so people may challenge our street cred. They may want to challenge us because we're not going to send our young people of color into Wall Street, to flood Wall Street. As someone whose father spent most of his life in and out of prison, Eddie and I do come from the same space. We were both displaced as children. There's a whole lot about us that you don't know. But one of the things that we know is that this is a business, keeping our people in prison and putting people through the system. You've got a young white guy who is at some college who gets arrested And it's going to be a very big difference what happens with him moving forward and what would happen with my son. And so, so I don't think you should feel bad about that, but I do think you are a political person. I mean, you say, how do I become one? You are one. You're here. You were there. You're talking about privilege. You're talking about your place in all of this. And there's going to be a place where you're going to fit in, where you're going to be engaged in transformation. I don't know if Eddie wants to add to that, but we don't. Eddie has gotten arrested, by the way. I don't. I'm claustrophobic. But yeah, it's a very different concern for young people of color.
Elizabeth is my legal observer, so if I go in, the thing about getting arrested is, you know, I haven't done it a lot. I pick and choose, like, one of the first, and what's interesting is every time I've gotten arrested has been on an EJ thing. I think the last one was Vieques. The first one was over that Bronx medical waste incinerator. We blocked the Bruckner Expressway, right? But here's the thing about civil disobedience. So what happened was about 20 of us were up on the highway. Only 8 of us, or 10, were supposed to get arrested. Anybody know Councilwoman Rosie Mendez? Rosie from the Lower East Side. So Rosie and I is like one of my oldest friends. We went to college together. Rosie was on the list of people that were not supposed to get arrested. I was on the list of people that were gonna get arrested, okay? When the cops came, everybody got arrested. And I think it was Rosie, one of them, as they were being hauled off, they said, but officer, I'm not on the list. And the cops said, honey, you're on the highway, you're on the list. So that's the thing about, if you're gonna take that risk, understand that it comes with all kinds of stuff. It comes with all kinds. I had to report that arrest on my employment with the mayor's office, and 1 or 2 other arrests that were not nearly as political. But so I had to, that stuff follows you the rest of your life, right? But also, as a person of color who's political, sometimes even that perversely is good for the soul. Every once in a while, you just gotta say, you know what, so all I can say is you gotta be judicious. Really, when you do one of those, make sure you try. Here's the thing, so it wasn't Flood Wall Street. Some of us were thinking about getting arrested when Climate Justice Alliance was gonna do that action at the UN. And I'm telling my people there are certain things you look for in civil disobedience. First, you make sure that there is a plan. As I was saying, make a plan, God laughs, right? But whatever. And if you feel that the people are not, if they don't have the legal observers tight, if they don't have the list, if they don't have it tight, don't do it. So approach it with the degree of seriousness that it merits. But it's something that, and I can't tell you how happy I'm to hear you say you check yourself, because listen, born and raised in Red Hook and Sunset Park, and I, to this day, still have to check myself and make sure that when I'm working in a community, that I'm giving them the tools, but that I'm not, and it's hard, right? Because when you come up in these places, especially your old neighborhood, they defer, right? But you don't develop leadership by constantly, it's like sunlight, right? You gotta let the sunlight, hit everybody. And so that, what you just said, I can't tell you, there are people that have been doing this their entire professional lives and don't learn what you learn, which is you gotta step back sometimes. So thank you for that.
Thank you. The mic was handed to me. So I'm more than happy to speak a little bit about my involvement with the march. My name is Raquel, and I was one of the organizers of the arts arm of the PCM. And we were organizing in a space in Bushwick called Mayday, which is still around. And we were tasked with the huge task of making the stories of the people who were involved with the march visible at the same scale of the march. So one thing that we spoke about and that I always think about is, climate change is a very left brain narrative. It's a very left brain story. There's numbers, there's CO2 numbers, it's percentage based, and how do we actually get people to think about it from a right brain perspective so that our stories and so that the emotional aspect of it can really be connected to wanting to take action, wanting to take climate action, and involving people who maybe before didn't feel like they were invited to the table. So one thing that we thought was that through the development of visuals and of the production of art and of spaces that invite people to have conversations, whether that be at Mayday or in South Bronx or in Harlem or in spaces in Sunset Park where we were organizing, how can we use those spaces to be generative spaces so that then people can begin to see that they have a role to play in climate action. And I think that we were successful in many ways. And you know, Elizabeth did say that the art earlier. It meant a lot to hear you say that, you know, the visuals of the march did resonate, and something that we worked really hard at, which I think Gon can speak about in a little bit, was the narrative structure of the march, so that when you saw the march, there was a whole story that was told, and what we're really looking at now is, as organizers who are continue to be involved in this movement and continuing to work at May Day, how we can use, how we can look at the networks that were created as a result of organizing together to continue to build out. And this isn't something that's Bushwick specific because we're located in Bushwick. This is actually something that is not space specific. So now we're looking at mapping and looking at where all the different organizations are that we worked with. Kaylin Callahan from the Rockaways is one of them. She can maybe speak a little bit to the organizing work that she did with the Shorefront community that wasn't just Rockaway specific, but that was Shorefront. So looking at people in organizations and individuals involved in South Bronx, Staten Island, really trying to build across difference to show that we have more in common than not, right? So to wrap up, it's really just, you know, at this point we're trying to see how we can look at those networks that we've created to continue to build into the future together. We have a potluck tomorrow evening at May Day at 7 p.m., which you all are totally welcome to come to. We would love to have more individuals there, you know, to talk to us about how you're interested in becoming involved in this movement as we move forward. And talk about the narrative structure a little bit?
Sure. I think it's really appropriate that we're having this very rich conversation inside of an arts space. And I think one of the very successful things about this mobilization was a recognition that art, which is really storytelling, is more than just decoration. It's more than just something you stick on top of your usual march and rally, and it's the same old with, you know, something pretty. You invite a singer at the last minute, you invite someone to make a poster at the last minute. Instead, it was integrated very deeply, I think, into the DNA of the organizing, which was really wonderful to see us take that big step finally. And I think that even played out in the march itself being organized into a narrative structure so that the whole thing told a story. So it wasn't just what was happening at the front, but that every community that was participating had a place in that story, and all of the struggles, all of the impacts, all of the community responses were being told and not being erased in the story of climate change. And I think one thing we did better than we usually do, not perfectly, but certainly better, was create a sense of unity without erasure, right? So that we were unified in this march, but we were not asking communities and individuals to put their story in the background in the service of the larger story. And that was really wonderful to watch that happen. I think that kind of narrative structure, the artistic structure, really allowed us to do that.
Do you have a question for that?
I do. And I think, you know, Elizabeth, our first interaction we had was about this: are we creating a movement or a moment, right? That was our very first conversation. And I think that's the question we have now in front of all of us. It's my question, and I would love to hear you guys speak to that, which is, we've created all this infrastructure, all these relationships, all this stuff, and it'd be so easy to retreat back into our silos, into our individual organizations, capitalize on what was created for funding purposes, or we can create this thing that's bigger than all of that, which we now have, which is this movement. And how do we keep those larger sets of relationships, all of that connective tissue, all of that stuff alive and growing?
I'll be brief first. I just have to say that, you know, our young people were involved in making those sunflowers you see in the front, and it was, they come to the office every day now. I can't even stop them. I mean, they are in. They're like, it just changed their lives and the lives of so many people you don't even know. And it was a sort of gentle way of introducing people to some really harsh realities. Art made that possible. And anyway, I'm not going to go into that. Let me answer your question, because I get all like emotional. A movement really sort of depends on how people will continue to show up. I think that's the thing. Raquel talked about mapping, and I think that really respecting the local institutions and the relationships with each other. Sometimes you show up with some good ideas and some good intentions, and you don't know the relationships that people have with each other, or even the bad relationships people have with each other that may have to do with real issues and not personal. Sometimes people think they're personal, but they really have to do with values. And so I think that those kinds of collaborations where you add value, where you complement what people are doing, and you work with each other in a way that really lifts the community and adds something to it that it didn't have before, makes it possible for us to grow this movement. So we are very knowledgeable about what's happening in each of the neighborhoods. You know, we've been doing this for a while. But we've seen where folks with good intentions have sort of come in on an issue, and then because they've come in hard on an issue to a community, an organization that was there for a long time, all of a sudden a bunch of doors closed, and they weren't able to get into those doors. I can use an example of Washington Heights, where there was a Dominican organization there that had a relationship with Columbia Presbyterian, and they were working it out, and some other organization that suddenly started growing and decided that they were going to start organizing in that neighborhood, never consulted with that organization, and made that organization's job at organizing so much more difficult. So it really has to do with how you show up, and and how you help spread and build these relationships in a way that is sort of grounded in those principles that I shared with everybody, and early on, the HEMES principles, right, for democratic organizing. And I think that that would be a really powerful thing that has to happen, that absolutely has to happen. You are needed, everybody here is needed, and we should be able to do it in a way that's never been done before, you know, and I think that people here have that in them to do it that way. I saw a lot of exploration and people checking themselves and people putting their best selves forward. I saw people who came who were like trust fund babies, trying really, a lot of those, trying really hard. And you know, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Trust fund baby out the bathwater.
If you think about the civil rights movement, right? If you think about the civil rights movement, you know that these were the people who were able to open the doors when our people couldn't. And so we needed them. And so this is a movement that really does, and this is not rhetoric, really does need all of us, but it's how we all show up and make it work with each other, and that constant dance of checking, so that we can really lay a strong foundation that we can build on. And I think it's possible, you know, so I'm sorry.
No matter. The question gone, and Elizabeth, I could just tell you from a personal perspective, it's happening. Like from a very just personal perspective, like 350 NYC, I didn't know who these folks were before, and even in the months leading up to the march, sometimes they would annoy the hell out of me. But now, like, I have to work with these guys, if for no other reason. They're on a divestment campaign with the controller. This guy needs his ass kicked. I mean, I don't mean that but just because on the heels of all this guy, he still hasn't committed to divesting New York. So we can't help it. It's there. And when I hear like mapping, and I hear that intentional, who's there, how can we work together, that is what's going to grow this movement. That you know, how do we work together? How do we? That's what I think the best thing we did with, not the best, but one of the best things we did with the march was stay away from the celebrity speakers, the stage, that stuff, because all of a sudden it was all of us. It really was kind of like this coming together of all these movements that had a stage been set up. You would have lost that. Think of the nuke movement. The last time 1 million people in the streets of New York, and yeah, it was at that moment that Ronald Reagan said, "Oh my God, now I got to start negotiating a nuclear freeze with the evil empire." Right? That the rhetoric up until that point had been all about that. 2 years later, he signed START 3 or whatever that nuclear disarmament thing was. So the point is that when the movements gel, and it's not about a central structure or a central leadership, because the central structures and leaderships, they're so easy targets to take out. Who are they going to take out now? You know, so I think that you're right, that the energy is there, and the structures, some of them in there, we just have to get the work done. But all I know from a personal perspective is I have to do it now. Work with people that I haven't worked before, and I'm actually looking forward to it, which is really weird.
I think we have time just for one more reflection, and also if you don't want to ask a question, that's cool. Just share your reflection. You're an organizer, just like our panelists here and others in the room.
Sure. Hi, my name is Kaylin Callahan. I'm from the Rockaways. Some reflections. So I work with a group called Rockaway Wildfire, and we really grew out of the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And although it might seem obvious that climate justice would have been the focus of our work, it really wasn't. Our main focus of our work is social justice and economic justice, because that's something that speaks to us in our community. You know, you talk about redlining and blockbusting and gerrymandering, like we know that very well, like very clear. That's created the social circumstances that we live in. And although there was 10 feet of water in my building, and although I lived with, you know, carrying my baby on my back for 3 months in the dark and the cold after Sandy, we weren't really working on climate justice. We were looking at the redevelopment that came after the disaster, and working specifically on a community benefits agreement out there for a big development project.
By the way, I think that's all climate justice you do.
Yeah, and that's what we've learned, and that's like, we've sort of reframed how we look at it and how those things intersect, and really the march was a great opportunity for us to educate ourselves as an organization. We have 10 coordinators, and we have like a base, and we had great trainers come through and like really teach us a lot, and it's been a wonderful opportunity in that sense. And I think also, like, I feel you on the power of artwork. We helped organize this Shorefront community contingent, and shout out to Gon and Raquel. You know, we made these big life preservers, and we did workshops in the Rockaways and in Staten Island and with different coastal neighborhoods, and sort of shoring up that solidarity, because in the Rockaways we're like super isolated, and sometimes it feels like we're just like alone out there. So it was really important. I think there was a lot of value in building that solidarity with other communities, and feeling like we're part of a much broader movement. Like our work is just not on a peninsula, you know, on this peninsula only. And I guess if I had a question, it would be, you know, I think we're one of the only groups doing real grassroots organizing in the Rockaways. There's really a culture of nonprofits that get lots of resources and are sort of propped up by politicians and take money from pipelines, and that's sort of like the landscape of organizing, if you want to call it that. And I think we're interested in maintaining and strengthening those bonds that have started to be created with other, you know, groups like Uprose, or how, like, I'm interested in insights about how to, like, we're interested in coalition work with other communities across New York City or beyond that, or how, like, if you have any ideas about, like, what's a good way to, because we also have been looking at this as the beginning, as a starting off point. We're going to continue our campaigns, but we want to also broaden it and really continue to look at our work through a frame of climate justice as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I always have to tell, I get a little worried, and this is not what you just said, Caleb, but I've gotten worried when I've heard climate justice thrown around in the lead up to the march, and since then, devoid of a race and class analysis. Like this climate justice is not, the term justice has a very long-standing definition and context, especially in the United States, when it's about people of color and low-income people who have been historically and systemically discriminated against. And so and I know that you guys know that, but too many other people don't. And the more that you guys could connect with, like, look, even in your own neighborhood, like what's with the Rockaway Youth Task Force, for every one of you guys and them, there are, and I know the group that you're talking about, I'm not gonna call them out here because it's not my place to do so, but I know the there's like 2 or 3 of those groups. And that's a struggle we have in all our neighborhoods. There's always, Jesse Jackson had this saying that there are the tree shakers and the jelly makers, right? We come from the tree shaking tradition. The jelly makers are the ones who come after we shake the trees, and they scoop up the stuff and they make the jelly. And for us is that tension is always there, it's always real. But once you understand, and it sounds like you guys have been for a while now, once you understand that there are like-minded groups with that same justice frame, and it's one that you cleave to, That's to me movement building. The other stuff, the jelly makers, the poverty pimps are always gonna be there. They're not the ones that are gonna change policy because they're beholden to the local elected officials who give them. One of the best stories I ever heard was Elizabeth had a councilman. This guy ended up getting thrown in jail, not nearly long enough, but this guy got thrown in jail for shaking down some developer. This guy wanted to gave up Rose like a $5,000 council grant. And unsolicited, he just gave them, so immediately Elizabeth's eyebrows went up, right? And then the other shoe dropped. He wanted essentially to take over the organization. He didn't say it like that, but she gave him the money back. The guy ran from City Hall to her office because people don't do that. They don't give money back to her. And it was probably the most liberating toss back of $5,000 I've seen. And $5 don't mean nothing except if you're living on shoestring. But $5 back from one of our groups, that's a payroll. You know what I'm saying? Like, so, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is your story, and I've told you a story. So.
Yeah. It's not even about my story. I just think a few things that are really important. I think that because we do grassroots organizing and we do the work we do, that we should be careful not also to judge other organizations that don't do that work. There are people in our community that provide real services that our people need. You know, GED programs, food pantries, all kinds of services, drug rehab, all kinds of things that are people who work really hard, who are from the community, and that's all they know. That's the way they're working with God. They're working it out that way. And they're also going to be part of this, and we have to integrate them into this, and we need to use the same values that we're using in terms of the Hermes principles with each other to use for those. We determine whether someone is running an EJ organization or not by looking at the leadership and looking at the board of directors. And there are inconsistencies on the left. You know, when Occupy happened, all of a sudden, folks from Occupy went into communities of color and stayed. They didn't leave. And they decided that they were going to be the leaders for communities of color. In my community, I remember doing a forum. We had a community event right after Sandy. The community called for it. That's what the Climate Justice Center came out of it. And this woman, this young white woman sitting there challenging me. And I said, do you live in this neighborhood? And she said, no. I said, well, you don't have a nickel in this quarter. Because there was an imperiousness, almost like, because I was older, she was going to challenge me. And I was like, oh, hell no, that's not going to happen in this house. Like, who are you? And I was able to challenge her. But that's not to say that that Occupy didn't do a good job in a lot of neighborhoods and was necessary. What they didn't do is show up with respect for leadership that was already there in a lot of communities. What they did in some cases was because they discovered social justice, was that they were able to use their privilege to start setting up institutions to compete and supplant the ones that were already there. And so their process, and in EJ we look at process a lot, their process was top down, was abused their privilege, and so not everybody feels about Occupy the same way. We are not going to be people's poster children. We don't do window dressing for somebody else's agenda. When we talk about coming from the grassroots, we're talking about from the grassroots. And so when I say how you show up, that makes a big difference. So that's not to, to say the people from Occupy didn't do a good job and they raised the issue. No, I give them that. But they overstayed their welcome in some places, And the reason I share that with you folks is because it is really easy for us to sort of get cocky and think, yeah, these people don't know or whatever. Let's not judge, folks. Sometimes we approach a complex problem in a different place, in a different way. And there's a need for a social justice construct. There's a need for that. That's real, right? But you know what? The churches do it in another way, and you've got these social service organizations. And listen, Uprails was, before I got there, a social service organization. I couldn't run a social service organization. I couldn't have young people who were at the mercy of a counselor. I needed young people who would take ownership over their lives, over their future, over their education. I knew the Department of Education wasn't going to change in their lifetime. I needed to see transformation right away. I needed to see young people that were at potential, not at risk. And so my frame was very different, and the organization went in a different direction. But there are other, but they go to those other organizations for services we can't provide, and those are necessary. So I think we need to approach this. I know this sounds corny, but we got to approach this with love, and we got to approach this with respect, and we need to be able to do it in a way where we can bring even those people who don't necessarily share the same process together, because they're going to be necessary. God forbid there's another Sandy, those people. Are there poverty pimps? For real, there are. We know that's true, right?
So everything she said applies to everybody but the jelly bakers.
But that's true, he's right. He's completely right about that, but I just don't want us to sort of get in a box and sort of start feeling like, you know, like we've got all the answers, because it's gonna, building resilience means bringing all of these different partners together to make our community stronger. And so I just want to say that because it's really important.
Thank you for saying that, Elizabeth. I think that's an important lesson for social movements in general, right? Is one, coalitions are messy, and to our movements, like we are not all going to agree always, but it's about bringing all the different actors together so that we can build counterpower. Not, you know, in spite of our disagreements, right? And so these movement moments provide us an opportunity to communicate to a global stage, as you said, you know, and some of the tools that we avail ourselves of are, you know, one of the things we didn't mention even is like the names in common, people's climate as a hashtag to knit together all the different manifestations, right? And what that communicates. The art, you know, that, was something that we saw in New York City that lifted up people's stories, yet provided connective tissue between them, even though they all didn't sit in a meeting and come to consensus, right? And that these are the ingredients of building counter power. And the last thing I would like to throw out is this idea of the global movement, right? Because we looked at New York City today, but also one of the things that I love about what Eddie and Elizabeth and their organizations do too is that they're not exclusively locally focused, right? They recognize that they're in relationship and alliance to the Climate Justice Alliance nationally and to groups internationally that are working in the Global South and other areas with the justice lens. Elizabeth, you mentioned adaptation and cooperatives and like how we're building more robust like power at the local level, communicating on a global stage through our visual communications and narratives. Legislation you brought up, right? So that's something that continues from the previous panel where Christian Parenti was saying our activist movements over the last couple of decades have been so anti-state and anti-legislation, yet recognizing, you know, for good reason when, you know, but recognizing also that regulation can be the thing that makes the difference. And finally, how we work together, and a reminder that actually no institution or no coalition is monolithic. So I don't know what organization you're at, but if I meet you and you tell me you work there, I'm gonna think that, oh, people like you work there. You know, you start to change the narrative in people's understandings. That's something we're trying to do with this project, is to pry open the institutions of, you know, natural history museums that present and educate the public about nature, right? To question the boundaries of our institutions and who gets to speak on behalf of them, right? And this is what People's Climate as a frame attempted to do as well. So thank you so much to Elizabeth and Eddie, to all of you who shared your reflections and who worked around the People's Climate March and who will continue to work for climate justice. And to everyone who came to this inaugural exhibition of the Natural History Museum. As Kaylee said, this is just a starting point. Right? More to come. So thank you.